Let me start off by saying that starting a company isn't exactly easy, but I'll do my best to offer some insights as an 11th grader doing research on the gaming industry exclusively. From that information, I'll offer tips on how to maintain a business in any genre. Starting now, we'll be looking at Epic Games. This is a relatively new company. They are mostly known for games like Fortnite and recently taking ownership of Rocket League. So let's take a look at how they started off. In 1991, Tim created the Unreal Engine, which was later used to create popular games at the time like Duke Nukem, Deus Ex, and plenty of other games. Of course, these companies didn't gain access to Tim's powerful engine for free. They had to pay about $350,000 for a license. And as years progressed, so did the engine. More and more companies were willing to pay for the license since the engine was much better than before, up until 2015, when Epic decided to make their engines free, but you'd have to pay Epic a 5% royalty once you'd reach a certain threshold of a monthly income from your game, which is a smart investment as more people would gain access to it, and for the pre-existing games using their engine, Epic would receive large amounts of money from them. One of the major contributing reasons that Epic was able to afford such an investment was because Tim sold 40% equity to a Chinese company known as Tencent for about $330 million. With all the money they received, they were able to make hefty investments into 3 of their games: Paragon, Unreal Tournament, and Fortnite. Of the 3, only Fortnite prevailed. And most recently, Epic Games bought the up-and-coming company, which was mainly known for Rocket League, Psyonix. Epic Games clearly has been well educated in their economies of scale. So as you can see, Epic Games has a massive backlog of smart business tactics, but the question is, how can we, as an unknown company, use their tactics? Well, for starters, it's unlikely that we could create something as monumentally successful as the Unreal Engine, but we could offer something similar. For example, we could feature songs by unknown artists. We would pay them an adequate amount of money, and as a fee for being in our game, we would take 5% royalty from any sales featured in our game. So now we're offering a platform for unknown artists while still earning money. As for selling a portion of our company and merging with someone else, those were good marketing strategies for Epic Games, but maybe not so much for an amateur company like us. We could attempt to sell less than 50% of our company, but we'd most definitely not receive anything over $1 million. So just like what Tim Sweeney did, we'll get most of our profits from our royalty fees, which we could later on invest a portion of profits to another one of our major project ideas, then pour most of our time and resources into the most successful one. As we can tell, Epic Games is a very well managed company and should remain as such for a long time. But now let's take a look at a company that had everything going for it and suddenly disappeared. But before we discuss this company's downfall, let me give a brief explanation of their massive rise to glory. Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney partnered together to make a clone of Space War, one of the earliest known digital computer games being released in 1962. Anyways, their clone of Space War was a commercial failure, but they still had hope of selling a game. They hired a design engineer who helped them make the infamous Pong. They later went on to create console ports of Pong and other arcade games, which is an important factor to their success and inevitable downfall. It's a well-known fact that Atari was making a home version of all the popular arcade games like Space Invaders, Dig Dug, and many more, but none of those could compare to one game in particular, at least in one aspect: their sales. I can say without a doubt that Pac-Man is an extremely popular game, but I never could have guessed that it was popular enough to become the best-selling game of its time, with Atari having over 1 million copies in storage before its initial release. Children were extremely pumped up to play Pac-Man at home, except once they put the cartridge in, they saw this. What was considered to be Pac-Man was replaced with a yucky yellow ball. These changes didn't go unnoticed, and people were understandably annoyed. People complained and were confused, yet people still bought the game for the sole reason of it being Pac-Man. There have been many rumors of why the game came out so poorly, one of those being that the head programmer, Todd Fire, was being paid in royalties based on how many copies of the game were made and not sold. Fortunately for him, those accusations were false, and the main reason was due to Fire being relatively new at programming. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was considered to be the worst game ever made. Howard Warshaw was the man behind the disaster. Howard was given roughly 36 hours to create the concept of the game, which players described as purgatory. The player would keep being shown the same locations over and over and over and over again. In the customer's eyes, this was a terrible game. But as we saw earlier, that doesn't always mean it was financially a disaster. First, let's look at what made Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 so popular. At the time, Pac-Man was insanely popular, even being considered the highest grossing arcade machine game of all time. Before its initial release on the Atari, children were highly anticipating the game, so most of the customers were already planning on buying it. Now, let's take a look at E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The game was based on the movie under the same name. The game was signed by Steven Spielberg, the director of the movie. Atari paid around $23 million for licensing fees, which was a surprisingly large amount at the time. So using our prior knowledge with the Pac-Man, it should be a commercial success. Wrong. It flunked. Kinda. At first, it did well, selling 1.5 million copies, being listed as the 6th best-selling video game upon release, and was Atari's 8th bestseller. Unfortunately, Atari overcalculated its success and created over 4 million copies of the game. Atari's plan was that the game would sell as a Christmas gift, which it did, just not as well as they expected. By 1982, Atari lost about $539 million, and all the extra copies were thrown into a landfill located in New Mexico. About 900 copies that were found in the hole were sold for $108,000 years later. Their failure not only had a massive impact on their own company, but the entirety of the gaming market. This failure was known as the crash of 1983. But we'll discuss that in a bit. So a valuable lesson that we can learn from this: if you are working on a new project, like a website, game, or anything that takes time, make sure to give yourself some leeway and don't rush yourself or workers. Secondly, a good reason of why they might have produced 4 million copies was to lower the fixed costs. Like I said earlier, Atari spent about $23 million for the licensing of E.T. So since they knew the game was going to do well, they must have decided to invest into making more copies of the game, which unfortunately didn't go so well. Finally, whether you're a big company or not, you must produce products that satisfy the customer's wants, because as mentioned before, Pac-Man may have been well sold, but after the first week of sales, customers stopped buying it. Granted, it didn't stop entirely, but compared to its first week of sales, it was clear that people weren't a fan of the new design. Before I discuss the important fundamentals of starting a video game company, or any company, I want to tell you about the video game crash of 1983. That one time in history that gaming in its entirety was basically massacred. Let me start off by saying that in the 80s, at-home gaming was super popular. So popular, in fact, that there were probably 5 times as many consoles as we have now. This oversaturation of consoles caused what psychologists refer to as overchoice. This wide variety of consoles caused customers to come to a halt with their purchases, and on top of that, the consoles themselves weren't cheap. They were the equivalent of buying a PC at the time. Granted, PC prices were decreasing substantially, but the point is, people stopped buying consoles due to computers being the equivalent price with better value. Well, you might be wondering, how does Atari tie into this? Pac-Man and E.T. Pac-Man was a highly anticipated game, but upon release, people quickly realized it was nothing like its predecessor. The surge of popularity coming from the poorly designed game inspired other companies to follow suit. The games that came from this massive movement can only be described as utter garbage. With this massive spike of bootleg games, people were slightly getting tired of the same game concepts and same terrible quality. Customers' demand lowered, which in turn caused the release of E.T. to be a complete and utter failure. With the number one gaming company releasing a failed game, this multi-billion-dollar industry was cut by 97% by 1985. While many people believe the main cause of this event was Atari's E.T., I believe E.T. was simply the catalyst. Because if we look at all the other factors at play, E.T. simply caused people to realize that video games were being lazily made, which wasn't always true, since another game that was released at the same time was Pitfall. To quickly summarize, Atari released two very poorly made games and other companies followed their lead, causing many consoles to be created. Customers, being overwhelmed with all the options, decided to stop spending money on consoles and move to PCs. With that interesting fact out of the way, now I can tell you about a few fundamental tips that I learned with my research. Fundamental rule number 1. A good way to start a business, this applies outside of gaming ones as well, is to always have a steady source of income from somewhere else. For Tim Sweeney, this was his game engine. He was able to sell licenses for his engine while still focusing on his own video game projects. So if I were to start my own company, it might be a good idea to maintain a part-time job or to create an early prototype of my game/project with some rewards like 10% discount on the full release or early access, so to add incentives for people to buy the game. Fundamental rule number 2. Sometimes the smartest move can be painful. Selling equity can be effective and beneficial, except it can be difficult to decide when to sell a portion of it and who to sell it to. Since if you sell it too early, you might earn little to no money, and if sold to an irresponsible company, they might not always have your company in the best interest. So, something to keep in mind while selling equity is to do background checks on the company buying it. When Epic sold 40% of equity to Tencent, they knew that Tencent wasn't new to the gaming industry. As of in 2010, Tencent bought 93% of equity from Riot Games, and as early as 2007, buying 5% from Activision Blizzard. The point being was that Epic knew that Tencent was not an amateur in this industry. Fundamental rule number 3. When working on new products, make sure to always maintain some sort of communication between the corporation and the customers. Take for instance the Pac-Man home cartridge by Atari. This game was worked on for about 6 months, but it looked nothing like the original. What Atari should have done was shown screenshots of the game on magazines, or gotten beta testers for the game to receive feedback and opinions on the design of a beloved game. Instead, they exploited the immense popularity of the game and released a decent game. They could have maintained the game's initial hype and doubled the sales as they kept the same look of the arcade Pac-Man. If they released images of what the game would have looked like, Atari would have received criticism and had time to redesign it, and maybe even delayed the release. To quickly summarize, always maintain an adequate bond of communication between the customers, and as a reminder, always take into consideration quality over quantity, as your customers might stop buying. These are 3 fundamental rules to starting any business. And so, to conclude, I will leave you with this. Compare my 3 fundamental rules to other businesses, and maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm right. Maybe these rules are used in every business. Maybe they're not. And if you do ever decide to start a business, maybe take into consideration my 3 fundamental rules. They might help you. Anyways, thanks for watching.